Curi's heart beat heavily within their chest as they gazed around at the frankly insane amount of people who had gathered to watch their arrival. It was hard to put a name to their feeling, but amazement was probably the most like it, even if that word had a bit too positive of a connotation to truly fit. Of course, they were used to stares. They were used to venomous gazes. They were even used to the screams of outright hate. And thus, they didn't show much of an outwards reaction, as they quietly observed the almost unreal happenings around them. But inside, they felt that this was all completely out of proportion. These many people couldn't all truly be here for them, could they? Despite their own comparatively extreme augmentation, and the heavy feelings that it stirred within so many of their fellow citizens of the community, they had always been left more or less in the shadows, where people preferred it not to engage with them, even if they did find their presence distasteful. Exclusion was the preferred measure of engaging with unwanted elements within the larger community, not whatever this was. Of course, they had seen this sort of thing while they had travelled with James before, so it wasn't completely out of what they understood. However, that was just the thing. It had always been with James. He had always garnered far more of a public reaction, and even though he often spoke about his dislike of it, he certainly knew how to engage with the public and how to produce himself in front of a crowd. Curi, on the other hand, well, they had taken this invitation, sure, but they had made no effort to sell it to anyone. They hadn't made any public comments about it, or even really talked to anyone outside of the people who absolutely had to know. And yet still, thousands of people had left their homes to come see them. Them, specifically, for both good reasons and very bad ones. As they glanced around, Curi also couldn't quite help but find the feeling of having to move with a protective bubble of soldiers around them to be very odd. It made sense to them. Intellectually, they understood the need for protection, as the situation had become far more dangerous than it had been in the past. Still, something about it felt so wrong to them. After all, they were here specifically to talk about the harm and exclusion of people like them, or people who were being separated from the rest of the community for too long for reasons that were simply not right. And yet here they were, deliberately cutting themselves off and othering them from the people who had come together for this event. Of course, nobody could really argue that they were separating themselves for any ideological reason. Far more, it was almost an absolute necessity to cut themselves off from the people, only for this one specific circumstance. Yet still, although it was far from being one, it somehow felt like a statement, though Curi couldn't tell who was making it. They themselves? The humans? Or was it the lingering statement of the galaxy that they didn't belong, that only took shape in the form of needing protection? Did it even matter which was the case if it only happened in their mind? Will any of what I say today truly matter? They couldn't help but wonder aloud, causing the concentrated gazes of their company, which had previously been affixed to the crowd in nervous tension, to shoot towards them, as the cyborg's voice pulled them all out of their thoughts. I was invited to start a dialogue with those affected by the violence against the extraneous. But that dialogue has been going on for a long time, and it has been hard fought by so many people already. What more could I possibly add? They had been very confident coming here, and they were still very much full of conviction to stand before the galaxy and make sure everyone could, at the very least, hear the truth. But standing here, surrounded by so many, they momentarily wanted to confide in their friends. They were going to say it all. They just also really wanted it to matter. James looked at them with an affected expression for a brief moment, before reaching his mechanical arm out and placing it on their side. Of course it matters, Curi, he told them, his voice filled with both empathy and assurance. You have been fighting this fight long before we have. Hell, without you, I wouldn't even be here. Yeah, Shida concurred, moving up to Curi's other side and placing her hand on them just as James had done. If you hadn't nudged me to go explore your laboratory after the explosion, Who knows how long it would have taken me to start questioning what I thought I knew. If one or two things had played out just a little different, I might not have seen the important things until it was already too late. Her ears hung slightly as she briefly lifted her hand and gently patted against Curi's metal shell. There are many things that I have to thank and apologize to you for, she said slowly, her expression and voice slightly glum as she looked away. If anyone's voice matters on the subject, it's yours. Indeed. A new, high-pitched voice chimed in, causing Curi to look up as Ajextia had turned her head around to look back at them while walking ahead. The yellow light in her mechanical eye twinkled slightly as she sought eye contact with her fellow cyborg. James and we have never made the choice to be as we are now. All we did was to fall victim to circumstance and then take the necessary steps to continue on with our lives unimpaired. Of course, we had the choice to forgo the procedure, but our decision has always been heavily slanted. But for you, it was a much bigger step. James continued on in the Lachesette's stead. Your wounds weren't physical, and although that doesn't make them any less severe, those are historically far easier to try and sweep under the rug. But you didn't do that. You had the guts to stand up and say, I don't want to be miserable anymore, and I don't care what you all think. Curi briefly looked away from the human and straight ahead as they thought about that. I don't think that guts had a lot to do with it, they said, familiar with the human expression, but still never feeling like their actions had been especially courageous out of all the labels you could possibly put on them. However, in their periphery, they could see how James shook his head. Only the strongest and bravest people I know have the ability to stand up against what seems like the entire world like that, he assured them. His fingers briefly lifted up to gently drum onto their body, while his face turned empathetic yet serious. I know I wouldn't have the nerve to do it. As Curi looked back up at him, it was just in time to see Nia catch up to her brother briefly, to nudge her elbow against James's side, causing the man to briefly turn to her with a deep smile that likely said much more than his words could have. I think... Shida then suddenly spoke up again, and Curi quickly turned their gaze to look at the feline, while Shida turned back towards them too, immediately making eye contact. If anyone can get the people to listen, it would be you. I mean, you've changed my mind. The hammering in Curi's chest picked up briefly in its intensity, as they saw the slightly guilty look on Shida's face as she said it, and they raised their foremost leg on Shida's side up to place it on her shoulder. Their mind briefly wandered back to their and Shida's first real meeting, and her intense reaction upon learning that James had so much as little plugs of metal in his teeth. Now here she stood, cheering them on as they went to what very well could be the most important event of their life. I can hardly imagine those days now, they confessed, the distant memory almost seeming like a fantasy or a bad dream as they reminisced. Shida lifted her hand and placed it on the leg, gently wrapping her fingers around it as she closed her eyes momentarily. Then, her grip briefly tightened and her face scrunched up ever so slightly as she seemed to fall into a moment of intense focus, to the point that her hand trembled a bit while it grasped onto Curi's leg. Curi looked at her with a moment of worry, but didn't quite know what to say or do, since they had no idea what had brought on the sudden shift in her behaviour. And so they simply allowed her to keep holding on while they waited for her to process whatever was happening in her mind. Finally, after a few very long seconds, Shida exhaled a huff of breath. Her grip didn't quite relax yet, but at least her hand stopped trembling as she still firmly held on. And although her eyes remained closed, her ears stood up, opening wide and turning in Curi's direction to demonstrate her attention. Don't let them get you down, she said, her voice quiet but much more firm than it had been before. Go out there and tell them how it is. We will handle the rest. She opened her eyes again, her yellow gaze sharp and in no uncertain way ready for a fight. Not in the sense that she wanted to start one, but in the sense that she sure as the tides was ready to finish one. Curi nodded slowly, pulling their leg back as the feline let go of it. "I will," they assured her, still a bit unsure of what exactly had brought that on. However, they felt her intensity, and just how serious she was about this, and they had no plans to disappoint, neither her nor themselves. Shida nodded back at them firmly, and then didn't say any more as she continued onward. By that point, James had also retracted his arm, and Ajaxia had turned to look ahead once again, leaving the entire group on a direct course towards the council building. On the way from the airlock to the council building, they could observe in real time how the composition of the crowd surrounding them changed with each separating line of soldiers they passed, as the orderlies tried their best to divide the crowd in a sensible manner. It was hard to tell just how the arrangements had been made. However, Curi's best guess was that it seemed like the more confrontation-prone a certain group had been assessed to be in one way or another, the further away from the actual building they had ultimately been situated. At least, that was what they had to assume, given that things got much, well, not exactly quieter the closer they got to the council. Maybe calmer was a more appropriate term, though it didn't fit exactly either. There was still a lot of energy clearly filling the crowd, and the quiet of what may have been thousands of people talking didn't ebb at all as they walked on. Yet there was a change that was hard to describe. The people they walked past now simply seemed less immediately tense. Curi had no idea what groups or affiliation they belonged to. They didn't even know if those people liked or disliked them, as they weren't nearly as vocal about that specific topic towards them. Still, the fact that people like them not only existed, but had come out in droves to view this event, it did fill the cyborg with some hope. And then, as they approached the, today widely cordoned off, entrance of the building itself, Curi had to do a double take as they spotted the final group of people that had somehow been allowed to stand closest to the cordons, who were giving off an extremely nervous energy based on their posture and behaviour, but then looked at Curi with big, amazed eyes and expressions as they saw them approaching. From their periphery, Curi could tell that they weren't the only one who had to look twice, as they noticed that specific group, as they saw the heads of the humans and Miat around them twitch for a moment, as their gazes became stuck to them as well. "Those weren't there when we left earlier," James mumbled, while the cameraman, who had been constantly circling the group so far to get the best angle for whatever he wanted to capture, turned the attention of his lens completely onto that anxiously awaiting group. "It looks like some very special people have made their way to the station to witness history and show their solidarity in these galaxy-shaking moments," the cameraman's green-haired colleague loudly said into an unseen microphone, as she stood next to her partner, watching on the screen of the camera as he zoomed in on the people waiting just behind the line of soldiers, likely to sync her voice up with the camera's focus. "It seems like they are finally done with allowing themselves to be pushed into the shadows, and now they have front row seats as things are about to be shaken up." Curi didn't know how much they liked that heavily dramatized description of things, but they hardly had the time to think much about it, as their steps almost immediately began to divert, absent-mindedly moving them towards the crowd, and leaving their escort to react to the sudden change. Luckily, James had the presence of mind to quickly realize what was happening, as he swiftly waved the soldiers along, signaling for them to allow Curi the brief detour. Curi themselves still found it a bit hard to believe their mechanical eyes, as they walked towards the row of soldiers that separated them from the crowd, stopping only a few steps away from the closest uniformed human among them, while also looking right past them, towards the people that had gathered there. If their eyes had the ability to tear up, they likely would have right there and then. Of course, the way they had approached hadn't gotten past anyone, and as soon as they had stopped, an Uroniak among the group leaned towards them over the human's head, just as far as she dared, without expecting to get into trouble for it. At a first glance, many probably wouldn't have seen anything all too special about her. That was, if one didn't notice the subtle yet, at closer inspection, very visible implants, which were situated right behind her ears that just gently poked out of her very plushy fur. Small, black and round, they looked almost like buttons that had simply been glued onto her skin by a layman, had it not been for the cables that pierced through the cartilage in the back of her auricle, and then led deeper into the ear itself.
"Oh, well, hi,"
the young woman greeted Curi with a hint of nervousness, her hands gently brushing over the thick fur on her chest, as she seemed at a loss as to what she should say.
I know it's probably a bit weird, but we're all here to cheer you on."
Among all the groups that had come to this station, the one present here was by far the least numerous one, counting just around 2 or 3 dozen members, depending on how many Curi couldn't see from where they stood. However, the fact that even this many of them had all come to the same place like this was already way out of the ordinary, because among them, the cochlear implants of the Uralniek were certainly among the most subtle of augmentations that Curi could see, even at just a glance. There were various forms of mobility aids, ranging from permanent, external splints, all the way to full prosthetic limbs. There were both implanted augmentations and full replacements for all kinds of sensory organs. And if their eyes didn't betray them, there even seemed to be a very few augmentations that seemed to have no other immediate purpose than being aesthetically or otherwise pleasing to their owner. One of them belonged to a Boskothier, whose thick horns had been deeply engraved with some sort of tool, while the engraving itself had been lined with metal chains which had, by now, been partly overgrown by the horn's thick keratin. The chains then led down from the horns, along the lines of his long muzzle, and then split up, with one end of each side connecting to a ring pierced through each of his ears, while the other ends came together in a third ring that went through the septum of his nose. Another was on the body of a Tshirt, a species in which evolution had transformed a large number of the hairs on their backs into a coat of thick protective quills. And in this specific individual, a large number of colourful metal spikes had been implanted in between those quills, simultaneously blending in with them, while also heavily breaking up the monotonous black-white appearance of the protective coat.
"We know that it won't really help all that much if we uselessly stand out here,"
the Tshirt spoke up, while Curi looked at them, and they shook their bodies slightly, which caused their metal implants to release a chiming noise as they collided against each other, indicating that they were hollowed out for the purpose of doing exactly that.
"But it's just so unbelievable that this is even happening. We couldn't help but be there for it."
The entire group then briefly glanced up as James and Ajaxia caught up to Curi, after likely giving them a deliberate head start. A brief mumble and murmur went through the group as the council candidates approached, who were just as much cyborgs as Curi was.
"It may not directly help me,"
Curi admitted, after processing the words briefly,
"but I am very glad that you are here. I am very glad that I got to see you before going in there. That there are tangible people that I will be making my plea for, and not just myself and my friends."
Looks of surprise and delight went through the group of cyborgs and otherwise augmented people, all expressing their joy at Curi's words in their own species-specific ways.
You have my vote, sir,"
the Tshirt then quickly informed James with a meek voice, only briefly glancing up at him before quickly pulling their eyes away again in a bashful manner. James clearly couldn't help but crack into a snicker. "Thanks, I appreciate it," he said, before bringing his eyes down to Curi. "It's time," he informed, fighting his amusement down to say it in a calm way, while he nodded back in the direction of Konglorch. "If anything happens, we'll be right out here with eyes on the cameras, and we will storm that damn building if we have to." Curi took a moment to focus themselves.
"I am sure that will not be necessary,"
they say in assurance, before beginning to turn away from the group behind the soldiers, though not without adding,
"Thank you all for your support."
Under some cheers, and without further delay, they then hurried over towards the rest of the group, while James and Ajaxia stayed behind for a bit longer, presumably to get a better picture of the peculiar visitors. From what I have heard in whispers, you might not need all that much of a bodyguard, Conglor stated with humour in his voice, leaning down towards them slightly as they approached.
That does not mean I don't appreciate someone who has my back immediately, Curi replied with less humour and more sincerity.
Conglorch gave a slightly amused bellow and nodded before lifting his head back up, though one of his eyes remained focused on Curi at all times. Their insistence on allowing no more security in the building itself is still suspicious as can be. Sam then joined the conversation, briefly pushing back her blonde ponytail before sighing, "But we've done our absolute best to assure nothing suspicious went in or out of that place, since we're able to do our last sweep of it, and we'll have an eye on it at all times. You should be about as safe as we can promise."
Curi nodded their body. "I trust your expertise," they stated.
"Yeah." Another one of the humans joined in as Admir approached from the side, leaning his arm against Curi's leg as he came to a stop next to them. "We've also made sure to thoroughly vet any of the news people who will be allowed into the building, just so we don't have an encore of recent events."
"That is appreciated," Curi replied once more. "I am confident that this place is far safer than any of the ones I have been in recently, despite the clear risks." "Yeah, but still."
Tuya then joined up, stepping right in front of Curi.
"You just need to holler and we'll be coming in with flying flags."
In a playfully confident gesture, she lifted her fist in a right angle and placed her other hand onto her biceps.
"I doubt I will even need to holler," Curi said, quite confident that the humans would likely sense danger far before they could make any effort to bring it to their attention. "But I will keep it in mind."
Tuya nodded and moved out of their way so they could proceed, as they were already running slightly late at this point. Andrzej kept out of the last-minute assurances, as the Major simply gave them a confident nod. However, before Curi could walk off, Shida quickly pressed against them one more time. She didn't say anything, and the contact only lasted a few seconds. However, it still said a lot. Shida pulled away as quickly as she had pressed up, and Curi gave her a single nod before finally moving towards the council building, with Conglorch following closely behind them. The soldiers guarding the cordon quickly opened it for them and stepped aside while the building's large door already opened on its own as well. Curi was admittedly a bit nervous, considering it was their first time to enter this very important place, quite unlike everyone else who was present. Still, they didn't hesitate, as they walked right over the threshold and into the enormous halls. The door closed behind them quite quickly, and immediately the difference between the outside and the inside was frankly staggering. Almost literally, as Curi had the brief urge to stop for a moment, as the intense white noise from the crowd died down entirely, and was instantly replaced with the almost oppressive silence of these enormous empty halls. The only sounds left were those of their own and Conglorch's footsteps, as well as the latter's deep breathing. Still, Curi pushed on, not letting themselves be perturbed by the sudden whiplash in atmosphere, not even as they suddenly found themselves in the view of the very judging gazes of rows and rows of Corwelder statues, which were the only inhabitants still left in this entry area of the council building.
"You know the way, right?"
Curi asked Conglorch quietly, realizing that they hadn't quite thought about asking where exactly they were even supposed to go in here. It all seemed so planned and organized that the thought of finding themselves lost in here hadn't really occurred to them. Luckily, Conglorch growled in mild amusement at their question. "There really is only one way," he replied. "Well, technically there's many ways, but they basically all lead to the same place." Curi took his word for it and simply kept walking, trusting that he would nudge them in the right direction should they somehow manage to go the completely wrong way. However, as they traversed the building that would have quite handily fit a small to medium-sized community inside it as a permanent residence, they soon discovered that it was indeed hard to miss their destination, since the entrances to the council's main hall, they discovered, were extremely well signposted, through both literal plaques designating them as such, as well as enormous lines of text engraved into the wall, which spelled out the community's famous motto: "Success to you. prosperity for all, unity in the community.
It seems like we are there,
Curi stated, as they briefly stopped in front of the colossal doorway. Do you want to turn back? Konglorsh asked, without a hint of judgment in his voice, waiting patiently behind them, without seeming to want to push them either way.
No,
Curi stated immediately, although their heart was quite firmly pounding in their chest.
But would you do me the favor to request entrance for us?
Konglorsh nodded, and an unclear sound released from his chest, as he briefly stepped to the side to use the terminal next to the door. As they were more than likely already being anxiously awaited, it barely took a moment before the door opened for them. As it opened, it revealed the view into a pristine room that was almost perfectly circular. Adjustable podiums were erected all around its circumference, on top of which the mighty members of the acting Galactic Council stood and waited, with their gazes now immediately pulled onto the new arrival. And right above them sat their larger-than-life counterparts of the First Council, immortalized into stone, sitting forever in judgment of those who came after them. Even their petrified eyes were wide open to witness history today. Curi felt their heavy gazes on them as they slowly walked further into the room, revealing their line of sight to more and more of the current council, the deeper they stepped into the circle. Such a pleasure to finally meet you, Curi. The first voice suddenly rang out from above, speaking in a strong accent and with a familiar cadence. Curi's eyes briefly searched for the source of the voice, quickly finding the podium that held a Miat with dark features and glass-green eyes.
Acting Councilman Tshirt, they greeted.
Although they had never directly met with the man who stood among Dunama's leading figures, it wasn't hard to guess the identity of the only Miat to have ever stepped foot in the council.
The pleasure is mine. I have heard a lot about you.
So have I, Tshirt gave back. As those two spoke to each other, the rest of the council had the necessary time to get their first reactions to Curi's presence out. There was a good chance that the very worst things could possibly have gone were preemptively warded off by the very fact that both James and Ajaxia had already lowered the bar through their brief ascendance into the council, since it meant that Curi wasn't exactly the first cyborg these highest of the high were directly confronted with, especially not in these hallowed halls. Still, it was unsurprising that a not insubstantial number of acting council members had expressions of barely suppressed disdain or even disgust on their face as they looked down at the cyborg. Many more of them managed to hide their feelings far better, although it was still quite easy to tell that they weren't exactly comfortable with being in Curi's presence, even if they had the necessary etiquette to not make it quite so obvious. The prominent positive disposition towards them appeared to be one of, ironically, curiosity. Many heads were tilted in order to get a better view of them, or in heavy thought. In some rare cases, the expressions of a few of the council members even indicated that this was the first time they had laid eyes on Curi in any way, shape, or form, heavily indicating that those particular members of the council did not have a large interest in keeping up with any current developments. And yet another reserved few looked down at them with an air of amicability, though it took many different shapes. Although it was far from the majority, it seemed that at least a non-zero percentage of the council truly did intend to use this as a chance to learn about an underrepresented part of the population they were meant to represent.
I thank you, Curi, for following my invitation.
A much louder voice soon spoke up, causing Curi's gaze to shift over to the by far largest, and thus easiest to spot, council member. Magistheria Avalogatha Tua sat with both ends of her trunk intertwined, as she looked down at Curi in a way that had her two downward-pointing tusks just narrowly missing the raised parts of her podium.
I know it was extended on quite short notice, so I am very glad that you can make it, especially after the rather traumatic incidents which you so tragically had to endure over these last few days.
Curi tried to read the matriarch's expression and demeanor as she spoke. However, They knew that their own ability to differentiate between pretended friendliness and actual amicability was comparatively limited. To them, the councilwoman's friendliness read as entirely genuine, though they could judge themselves enough to know that they shouldn't put too much stock into that.
Those traumatic events are precisely why a conversation like this has been bitterly necessary for a very long time,
Curi replied. They spoke loudly, but didn't yell, even as they found themselves quite far away from the council members, as they stood so far below them.
I see you agree with the motivation behind my invitation, then,
Magisteria replied, and untangled her trunk to lift it into a Y shape.
Indeed, this sort of violence has been allowed to proliferate for too long, even under the Council's watch. It is tragic that it took such extreme events to open this Council's eyes to it. However, that is no reason to not act upon it late, rather than never.
As the Zodiatos spoke, Curi noticed how Konglorch had loosened himself slightly from behind them. The Tenashasite began to make subtle sweeps through the room, seemingly keeping a tight watch out for anything that may have been out of the ordinary.
Indeed, it is not, Curi concurred with the acting councilwoman. No matter how old a mistake is, a chance to fix it should always be taken.
Quite. A tall-grown Limogassel who sat close to Magisteria agreed. He had been among the people who seemed curious about Curi's arrival. In case you do not know of me, I am acting Councilman Vuhushwa. He then briefly introduced himself, and lowered his long neck into a bow before lifting his head up again. I must admit, I was quite shocked the more I learned about the situation concerning those of your disposition in these last few trying months. While I must confess that I always knew the situation was far from friendly towards you, I never knew the kinds of violence people would reach for in retaliation for the mere breaking of a social taboo. It seems that we have allowed tradition to get out of control. A huff was then broadcast through the room's speakers, hailing from one of the podiums across from the large Chaya Petra. Traditions that have long earned their place and shown their worth. A quite indignant-looking Cimareskis woman, who Curi recognized to be acting councilwoman Komuka, exclaimed into the room. The primate's lips were pulled thin over her long teeth as she spoke. Should we really be so quick to dismiss them on the basis that some people simply refuse to follow them? That is hardly the tradition's fault. Vuhushwa let out a scarf through the nostrils, situated on the bottom of his jaw in return, causing them to flare widely. It is not about the tradition itself, but about the way people seem to interpret it, he countered, without giving an inch of ground to his fellow council member. No matter how deep his roots may go, you cannot possibly argue that we should condone violence towards those whose crime is nothing but moving away from old customs. Komuka huffed once more and weakly brought her flat hand down onto the podium. You want to make it all sound so incredibly easy, when we all know... She began to loudly argue, when she was suddenly interrupted by a loud trumpeting sound.
Please, everyone.
The acting councilwoman Magisteria spoke up once more, her trunk sinking down after producing the loud, attention-grabbing sound.
First and foremost, we are here to listen to Curi. A dialogue about what they tell us can be started afterwards.
The Colossus looked left and right for a moment, to assure that the two bickering parties had gotten the message. As they remained quiet, she then gestured down towards Curi, with an inviting gesture of her trunk.
You have the word,
she said, with an assuring tone. Curi's heart still hammered away, but they had long made up their mind, and so they didn't hesitate once they got the go-ahead of those in control here.
Thank you, they stated firmly. As you all have surely been told or put together yourself, I am a rather special case, even when it comes to those who are augmented or otherwise extraneous.
They established first, before pushing themselves up with their legs a little more to stand somewhat taller.
However, before I speak for and about myself, I would like to talk with you about those who have never had a choice.